It's very common to hear that we need regulations to control the risks of AI. And these risks are very familiar, right? There's ethically discriminatory AI, there are privacy violations, there's hallucinating large language models, and on and on and on. But my guest, Dean Ball, he's a research fellow in the Artificial Intelligence and Progress Project of George Mason University's Mercatus Center, and also the author of a popular Substack called Hyperdimensioning, is unconvinced. Dean does not think that we need regulations for AI. He does think that we need an energetic and robust government response. Those are his words, not mine. But it's not necessarily the case that we need a new regulatory regime. So, for instance, one thing to think about here is other ways we might reply to the risks of AI, particularly when those AI risks are realized. We have an entire criminal justice system and we have existing laws and regulations, and we can use those existing laws and regulations plus the existing criminal justice system to prevent people, to stop people, to punish people from various kinds of wrongdoing, the kinds of wrongdoing with which we're quite familiar. So, as one example, it's already illegal to engage in fraudulent practices. And if you happen to use AI to engage in those fraudulent practices, you're still doing something wrong. It doesn't matter that you used AI or not. So we have existing fraud laws. We have a criminal justice system that is accustomed to prosecuting people or organizations for engaging in fraud. And it doesn't matter the tool. So do we really need special AI fraud regulations? Probably not, says Dean. But here's a more general question that Dean asks. He asks it almost in passing in our conversation, but it's in some ways really the focus of his attention. He asks, what's the right layer of the stack to regulate? And when he says the stack, he means everything from there's the data that you train AI on, there's the AI model itself, there's the AI model embedded in some other larger solution, there's what people are doing with the AI. These are all places where we might intervene. And is it so obvious that what we should do is we should regulate at that model level, or rather at the use case level, as the European Union AI Act does? Dean thinks that if you're going to regulate AI, what you should really be focused on is regulating conduct. But then the question arises again, do we really need new AI regulations, or do we just need certain kinds of regulations barring conduct that we don't want? Let me give you one more example that Dean offers. Instead of regaling against AI being used for surveillance at the workplace, perhaps we should have laws about surveilling employees independently of what tool you're using. So maybe we need new workplace regulations, but that is not the same thing as an AI regulation. In general, what Dean says is that we've got lots of existing regulations. We have lots of ways to regulate conduct through policies, the criminal justice system, et cetera. And we can pass technology agnostic regulations regarding forbidden conduct. So, what do we need special IA regulations for? Okay, that's the topic of conversation today. I'm Reed Blackman, the host of Ethical Machines. If you like this podcast, take out your phone, just hit the 5-star thing. It doesn't take long. Take out the thing, hit 5 stars, boom, you're done. And share it with your friends and, I don't know, write a review. And if you got any things you want to say to me, you hate me so much, you love the podcast so much, or more importantly and more usefully, you want me to talk about a certain issue or talk to a particular person, please email me at that's Ethical Machines, at reedblackman.com. All right, let's go talk to Dean and figure out why we don't need AI regulations after all. Dean, it's very common for people to call for regulations of AI because, after all, it looks like we've got a very powerful technology on our hands. There's all kinds of harms that have been articulated by a variety of people, myself included. But you are, I want to say, you're against regulating AI or something along those lines. So, is that right? Do I have you right that you're against regulating AI?
I'm against hastily regulating AI. I think the most important thing to do is to think about the ways in which we already regulate AI. My general view is that AI is a general purpose technology. And by being a general purpose technology, that means it will be used by humans to do all the things that are already regulated, whether through criminal code or corporate regulations or all sorts of things like that. And so I think the most important thing that policymakers need to do right now is to think about how existing laws apply to AI. Do they create undue barriers to AI? Should they be updated? because AI actually creates a loophole in them. But in general, I think my view is that our laws already codify the normative standards that we have as a society for human conduct, and that therefore it's not intrinsically obvious to me that AI requires a sweeping set of new laws.
One common thought around this area, I take it, is something like, we've already got anti-discrimination law. I don't care how you do it. I don't care if it's a hiring manager that's a human being or if it's an AI tool that resulted in the discrimination. Nonetheless, there's no reason to think, as far as I know anyway, that anti-discrimination law doesn't already apply. We don't need also you can't discriminate with AI. That's a given. Is that the kind of thing that you're thinking about?
Yeah, basically, or an example I love to point out frequently is fraud. AI
Mm,
will surely enable all kinds of novel forms of fraud. GPT 4.0 announced 2 weeks ago or so with its voice, its ability to do very convincing human sounding voices. Surely that can be used for all kinds of malfeasance. But what kind of malfeasance can it do that isn't already illegal?
that's a good one because everyone's freaking out about deepfakes. And your
Yeah.
point is something like, we don't need special laws against deepfakes. We already have laws against fraud. This is a new way of committing fraud. So, no need to get the regulatory wheels in motion.
Yeah, for the most part, there might be situations, especially on deepfakes, where there might actually be some. I've been involved in some state government work where there's been serious analysis of the existing law, and it actually might be that there's a bit of a loophole with AI generated deepfakes. So you got to close
Hmm,
loopholes like that. But that's mostly just about nips and tucks. It's not about a radical new regulatory regime. However, the big caveat to what I'm saying is that just because I don't think that AI requires a great deal of new laws per se, that doesn't mean that it doesn't require an energetic and robust government response.
hmm,
Deepfakes would be a great example. Okay, deepfakes are illegal. Let's just say that we've clarified that's true everywhere in the country. What are you going to do
sure.
about them? How are you going to know who distributed the deepfakes? How are you going to know what is a deepfake and what isn't? A lot of these things, though, are actually they're political problems with technical solutions, which is a little bit of a new footing for our government to be on, where we actually need engineering first policy
That's
solutions to solve these problems.
that's so funny you say that because everybody loves to say in the ethics and regulatory space, AI is a socio-technological problem. You can't divorce the technology from the society in which it's embedded. You can't solve the problems with more data or with more software or more AI or something along those lines. We need socio-political solutions to this sort of thing. And this is you saying, I take it, nah, actually, it's a tech problem. Yeah, it's a political problem in the sense that the politicians or the bureaucrats or whomever is engaged in the operations of government has to tackle these problems and create the appropriate initiatives and follow through on those. But really, what those primarily involve are tech solutions. Is that a fair characterization of your view?
I think if we're talking about solutions to a specific problem like deepfakes, that would be a fair
Yeah.
characterization. As a general rule, though, I do have a lot of sympathy. In fact, I think almost all technological problems are socio-technological problems in the sense
Mm,
that what we're concerned with is the impact of technology in society. I have pretty radical uncertainty about the capabilities trajectory of AI. But it is certainly possible to me that if AGI or artificial superintelligence are real and tangible concepts in the near future, they will constitute a revolution in human affairs. And that will surely be deeply socio-technical in many different ways. So I wouldn't say that I dismiss entirely those things, but I would say that if we're talking about solving specific problems, it's just not obvious to me what new social technologies or social interventions are required for something like deepfakes. When I hear people say things like that with stuff like deepfakes and misinformation, I have a Jeffersonian in me, someone who really likes the Constitution, is pretty jealous of my 10 rights in the Bill of Rights, and hear things that make me a little scared in that regard. When I hear people
mm.
saying we need new social interventions to protect against misinformation, I'm like, ah, yes. And who will be the determiner of misinformation? I suspect it's you.
Yeah, no, that's fair. So let me ask a sort of bigger question then, in a way. Everyone, not everyone, lots of people are familiar with the European Union Artificial Intelligence Act. It's a giant regulatory scheme to deal with AI. And I think most people, maybe I'm wrong about this, but most people who have heard about it or are familiar with it are generally on board with some kind of regulatory approach. The approach seems Yeah, everyone likes to call it a risk-based approach. So we have a risk-based approach, and it essentially what it says. Obviously, there's some things that are banned, and so one question for you is: are the things that they say should be banned? Does that sound right to you? And then the second thing is the rest of it is just, hey, there are certain things that are high risk, which they don't put it this way, but it's something like if you're going to play some role in whether or not people have access to the basic goods of life, you got to really take a super hard look at what you're building and make sure that you look for risks and mitigate them and document all that, et cetera, et cetera. And that seems, I don't know, fairly well advised. So why push against such a thing?
Yeah. So first of all, in terms of the prohibited acts under the EU AI Act, some of them make a lot of sense to me. I think some of them will backfire and some of them already have backfired. So I'll just give you an
Mm,
example. One
yeah.
prohibited thing in the European Union AI Act is the use of emotion recognition AI models in classrooms and workplaces.
This is just software that says it's a camera, you run AI over it, as it were, and it says this person is feeling happy, sad, joyful, surprised, disgusted, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, exactly. So GPT-4o, which was announced at least a couple of weeks ago,
Oh.
has this new feature where you can turn your phone camera on and you can ask the model in real time, using your voice, and it will respond with a voice. What emotion does it look like I have? Or conceivably, what emotion does it look like this person I'm talking to has? It's not obvious to me why that's a problem, but it might make it so that it's also not obvious to me that you can just turn that specific capability of GPT-4o off. And
Mm,
so we've stumbled in quite quickly. The EU AI Act wasn't even officially law when GPT-4o came out. We've stumbled in quite quickly to a situation where the European Union seems to have said GPT-4o is illegal in classrooms and workplaces. The most powerful frontier AI model on the market today is
yeah.
illegal. That
That one's,
doesn't seem
I take it,
optimal to me.
yeah, that's a really interesting example because to a lot of people, there's two problems with that kind of technology. Number one, it's just shitty science. That's one view, that it's just this emotion recognition software doesn't actually recognize the emotion that people are feeling. It's akin to phrenology. It's not legit. So there's one set of concerns around whether it's accurate or not. And then relatedly, whether you can justifiably draw certain kinds of inferences from the emotion, right? So someone might be manifesting the emotion of happiness, but it's disconnected from what the actual conversation is about. They just happen to be thinking about their kids at the moment or something like that. And so one problem is just scientific or something like that, whereby either it falsely identifies the emotion or probably more probable is that people make the wrong inferences based on those identifications. And so that's one set of concerns I take about that kind of technology.
Sure.
Second kind of concern is surveillance. It feels too creepy or something along those lines, or it feels like an invasion of privacy for some reason. And
Hmm.
so I guess why it would be banned in the context of work and school is because A, it's too much surveillance, and B, especially for children, it's too invasive. It's too playing too fast and loose with that kind of data. I guess that's the rationale behind it, right?
Yeah, I think for me, there's really three approaches to this problem of AI regulation, as I've laid it out. One is a model-based approach. So that would be like, there's a bill, maybe we can talk about it later, maybe not, called SB 1047 in California. It's probably the most important AI legislation in America right now. That is a model-based bill. It imposes normative, mandatory standards for models. Then there's use-based regulation, which is the AI Act, where we're not going to regulate the models because regulating software, regulating bits is just challenging in a lot of different ways. So instead, what we're going to do is regulate everyone's downstream use of AI. So if you're in financial services, you're going to have a set of regulations. And if you're in healthcare, and it's not going to be the same regulations that you already have, it's going to be if you're in healthcare and you're using AI, then see Chapter 8 of the
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
regulation handbook. And then
Yeah.
there's really what I advocate, which I call conduct-based regulation. And that's the idea I was alluding to earlier, that the laws we have, whether it's hospital regulation or the criminal code, they codify the standards that we have that we would like to set for human conduct, basically. And so we should take a technology neutral approach. And this isn't always true, but as a general rule, as a kind of default assumption, it doesn't necessarily matter if you're in a healthcare setting, whether you're using AI to treat a patient. Now, that is different. There is an exception to that, which is if you're that Food and Drug Administration and you're approving medical devices, then you probably want to have some standards for that device. And if there's AI models in that device, then you might want to have standards for those models. But again, that's really just fitting in with the existing structures that we already have.
Right. Okay. So we lost track of one strand of the conversation, which was about whether the EU AI Act should ban or should have banned emotion recognition software. One sort of thing that we can get into, but we could get into it later, is whether it's, and I thought this is what you were getting to actually, is that it's in many instances it's not ethically or otherwise objectionable to just run the emotion recognition software. That we wanted a clear articulation of the conditions under which it's not allowed, and then disallow those ones as opposed to a blanket, a more general ban.
Yeah, my view on the emotion recognition stuff is, I don't know, I have emotion recognition software in my brain, and it hasn't been
Mhm.
scientifically validated. No one's done, there hasn't been double-blind peer review done on my ability to recognize, and I could very well be wrong too, just as well as the model could. Model might be better than
Yeah.
me. It's a
Yeah.
lot of
This is
people
what.
have problems with recognizing other people's emotions. Model might be better than them. So I think it's like, to me, it's not unlawful for me to recognize people's emotions. And I just can't really understand why it's in a workplace or school setting. I can't really understand why it's unlawful for it to happen there. Now, I can understand if I'm a manager at a workplace and I want to surveil all my employees, to look at their faces all the time and read their emotions all the time. I understand that's creepy, and I think that kind of workplace surveillance is something we need to work on. But it's not obvious to me that AI is the right layer of the stack to be regulating out there.
Yeah.
Like, that might just be more of a workplace regulation.
Yeah.
It's not obvious that we
Yeah.
need to say like a blanket ban on AI emotion recognition.
Suppose you could also probably think of some cases in which it would be appropriate at the workplace. So suppose, as it were, an alarm goes off when someone is manifesting fear. The fear might be in response to a real danger. And so
Yeah.
it might be a way of ferreting these things out. Anyway, I don't know. But I can think of, there's probably some beneficial use cases where you want it to happen.
Yeah.
And you raise a point that comes up again and again in lots of conversations that I have, which is, look, we humans do these things, then an AI is doing it. Why is the fact that it's an AI doing it as opposed to humans doing it a problem? And
Exactly.
here's the thing, and this is really the point that really comes along. Humans are really shitty at lots of stuff. We're really bad at stuff. Like, for instance, lots of people are very bad. Forget about, I don't know, mental challenges. Just the average person is not good at reading emotions off other people's faces. They're just, they're not good at it.
Yep.
And if an AI is better, what's the problem of using an AI instead of a human? There may be cases in which it is ethically objectionable, but it's not a priori. It's not obvious that in all such cases it should be banned. So I think that's right. Okay, but now let's go back to this other stuff that you were talking about, which I also find interesting, which is this model governance versus use governance versus conduct governance.
Mhm.
And I take it your claim is something like, all right, so look, the model is a very specific thing to regulate against. It's models are usually, first of all, in any sort of thing that consumers touch, there's usually more than one model involved, or there's often more than one model involved. It's embedded in a larger product, so it's like has a more general casing, or it's a part of a whole. And so the model feels like it's too small of a thing to regulate against.
Mhm.
Use case makes more sense, I think, and that's, as you said, the EU AI Act's approach. Let's don't do this. Yes, you can do this. Okay. You want the conduct approach, which is something like we've already got. I think, tell me if I have the conduct approach right. I haven't heard this before. Just, there's already things you can't do. Just don't do those things, whether it's with AI or not. Okay. But here's a bit of pushback. It's not a sort of principled pushback. It's more of a pragmatic pushback. It's something like, I don't know, look, I've worked with lots of companies. I've seen lots of companies, and their sort of oversight of how they design and develop and deploy AI is really, it's less than stellar. When it comes to how people behave, there's pretty good, like, risk and compliance. There's policies and procedures, and there's oversight, and there's HR overlooking people, and there's methods by which people can report people, blah, 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 blah. There's training about good conduct. And I'm not saying that it's a sort of ethical wonderland in corporate America, but at least there are mechanisms, clear mechanisms by which at least the people are overseen so that the bad conduct is, at least in principle, findable and actionable. With AI, it seems to me that even though that in the abstract, these companies or people and the executives, et cetera, tend to understand that things can go sideways with AI, there's nonetheless a sort of that's a data science problem. It's not an say it's not an operations or an HR or a CEO problem. It's more of a like the AI people have to get their technologies in order. And of course the technologists, the data scientists, for the most part, yeah, we got this. Don't worry about it. That's mostly driven by hubris and naivete, I think, on their part, ignorance. And so, one reason why you don't do this conduct thing, if I understand it, and why you do the use case thing is that it feels to me like it's something more actionable. It's forcing the hand of companies in a way that the conduct approach doesn't. Because the sort of the alarm bells have been ringing for a while, and the vast majority of companies out there are extremely slow to adopt anything that I would say is like risk and compliance and HR over people.
Yeah. And are you talking about like companies that make AI products, or are you just talking about companies that might use AI to do other business things? Or
Both.
both?
Now the waters are muddied because you have OpenAI and Microsoft and Google, et cetera, making the foundation, Anthropic, making the foundation models. Then they get fine tuned or tweaked in various ways by downstream developers at other companies, their customers, their clients. And so it's no longer, or not primarily, I don't think, off the shelf solution. It's here's the foundation model. Now we're going to put it into your business. And so
Yeah.
there's lots of cooks in the kitchen. And I think that just as a pragmatic point, if we want wide scale adoption of what you can call AI ethics practices or responsible AI practices or AI governance, you have to force their hand because a lot of them are either they don't really know the risk or they've got a pretty big risk appetite
Yeah.
or they think they falsely that they've got it. And it seems to me like a big sweeping regulation like the EU AI Act is the kind of thing that forces companies to pay attention and act. And in the absence of that, while you will have not insignificant subset of companies get their act together and make sure that they design and deploy AI responsibly, that's going to be like, I don't know, I'm going to say less than 50% of all companies. And then the
Yeah.
other 50%, it's going to be the Wild West with them, and that's not desirable. That's why we need the kind of sweeping regulation that is the EU AI Act. I don't know, but maybe
Yeah.
that's a stupid approach.
I understand what you're saying. I think a couple of things. I think, first of all, we have the diffusion of AI, a general purpose technology, throughout society, adoption by individuals and businesses of all sizes and all kinds of different industries. I think the idea that you can de novo craft normative standards for the use of that, I think that's just probably not true. I think you would probably keep. I'm pretty epistemically humble about the ability of policymakers, no matter how smart or well intentioned, to do grand things like that. The other thing I would say is like when I hear arguments like this about various like potential or observed bad things that have happened with AI, again, I always come back to what are they doing? Have they violated the law?
Yeah, one thing that I think about is something like I've been playing around with a Venn diagram where the Venn diagram is the unethical things that one can do with AI and the illegal things that one can do with AI. And what are the things that are at least currently, then there's another one of should be illegal but is not. And so you've got these three circles, and I'm trying to figure out really what should be in that third circle because I get more or less, I don't have deep knowledge, I'm not a lawyer, about what the illegal things are that one can do with AI. There's a bunch of things that are unethical that are also illegal. Obviously, the anti discrimination law stuff is one obvious example. It's unethical to discriminate against people of color, and it's illegal to discriminate against people of color, let's say in the hiring process. There are some things that are unethical that shouldn't be illegal. We don't make illegal any unethical act outside of AI, right? I can cheat on my spouse, so that would be unethical of me, but it's not against the law to do. So I'm not going to get jailed for it. It's not a finable or a jailable offense. It's just unethical that I betrayed my wife. And so that's unethical, but shouldn't be illegal. And so then the question is, okay, what's in the set of things that is unethical and is not illegal and ought to be illegal? What's in that bucket? And I do have trouble filling out that bucket sometimes.
There's like some emerging things that seem to me like they could be, although there are also things I'm quite fond of dispositionally, but I could see them going in problematic ways. Like it is possible with AI just because of like a language model's ability to analyze and read and output enormous amounts of text. You can harass people in like using regulatory means. You can also harass regulators. You can bombard them with paperwork in an asymmetric way. For
Yeah.
example, I'm just thinking of regulatory agencies at the federal level will do requests for comment, where they'll request public comment. Currently, as far as I know, it's not illegal to submit comments using AI. But you can totally imagine a world in which some group of people doesn't like a regulation and uses an AI agent to submit 20 million comments that are all 50 pages
Yeah.
long. And
Yeah.
the problem with that is that the regulator right now, I think by the law, like
You have to
somebody
read it
at
all.
yeah, have to read them. They have to read them all.
Yeah.
And that's actually, I think that this is there's Biden administration internal agency guidance that has to do with this, where they talk about having to read every word by a human. And that's the kind of thing where, okay, government is regulating itself here, which is like maybe not the wisest thing in the world. I can see why they did it, but it's maybe not the wisest thing. It creates an asymmetrical opportunity for nefarious actors to
Mm.
misuse the public process in ways that could create problems. I think
Yeah.
it's like unambiguously unethical to use AI to submit 20 million public comments. But at the same time, is it unethical for me to use AI to help me write a comment? Let's say I feel passionately about the outcome, but I'm not a lawyer and I don't know the best
Right.
way to make
Right.
it. No, that's absolutely not unethical. So if an AI model wrote the entire thing for me, every single word of a public comment, but it was what I thought, that's not unethical.
Yeah.
But the other thing is, so it's complicated, but I can imagine stuff like that. I'm not sure we need a legal response to that, but that's in the
Yeah.
category of thing. And I think that generally the proliferation, if it happens, of AI agents, models that can take action on the user's behalf, will generate like 1 billion things of this kind, examples of this kind. And I think that what we will need in the long term is a way to scale up intermediation of conflict between different parties. Like we do that right now through the judicial system, but the
Yeah.
judicial system is expensive and slow. So is there a way that we can make that faster? Maybe through binding arbitration? I don't know. Maybe through a new kind of judicial system. I think there's work that has to be done there. But I do think that AI agents could cause problems like that. And we would benefit from kind of a new architecture of governance to be able to just like more quickly resolve disputes like that and hopefully update the law in iterative ways to deal with things like that. Because there are so many things in like common law type processes where it's exactly what you're talking about. Unethical, questionably illegal. How do we deal with that? That's a big chunk of the cases that make it up the chain in federal courts.
Yeah. This sort of speaks to what you were saying at the outset, which was something like you don't think that big sweeping regulations are necessary, but you do think a vigorous, robust government response is necessary. It's just not obvious that the way in which they have to respond is by regulation. So maybe in this little particular asymmetric attack account or issue, it's a matter of having a new policy or something like that, where the maximum length of a comment is 10,000 words, or it can only be, a comment can only be submitted by one person or one entity max. Or I don't know. This is obviously, I don't
Yeah.
know anything about this, but my point is that feels like the kind of problem that can be solved without having to go through a giant regulatory process. But
Right.
something needs to be done.
And another great example, this was actually in the Supreme Court last year, not AI related, but you could easily imagine it being related. There was a woman, I think in Colorado, it doesn't really matter, who was in a wheelchair or something like that. And she had this little hobby where what she would do is she would go on hotels' websites, like random boutique mom and pop hotels, and see if they had to have certain information about, the Americans with Disabilities
Yeah.
Act compliance at their hotel. And if they didn't have that information, then technically under the ADA, you can sue them for $10,000. And so she
Right.
filed like 500 of these lawsuits at like hotels that she never intended to stay at. And she's basically just using the ADA to make
Yeah,
money,
she's
to
gaming the
make income.
system. Yeah.
And yeah, that's like unethical and maybe in a certain sense, like mega illegal, since she's like using the plumbing of the ADA but certainly a manipulation
Right.
of the law. So yeah. And again, that went to the Supreme Court. I forget how it was resolved, but those are the kinds of things that already we do adjudicate in court. So it seems to me that we shouldn't forget that the judicial system exists and is like part of our system for a good reason.
And one thing that gets me nervous is really high stakes use cases. And maybe this is me thinking about the EU AI Act. I'm thinking about like when we're going to use AI in the criminal justice system or when we're going to use AI in healthcare. These are really massive implications. And to just say something like, I don't know, just make sure to use AI in compliance with current law. Ugh, that makes me very nervous. But maybe I
Mhm.
shouldn't be. I don't know.
So I guess I definitely agree on those sort of very high stakes things. And I think that's like probably not where we want to start with
Mm,
adopting AI and those things. Like we probably want to start on lower stakes use cases, especially the judicial system. That is already, though, a highly regulated, scripted, structured environment. So I think it just will necessarily be introduced in pretty slow and considered ways into the judicial system. But I think that this is an example where there is some need for review of existing laws in those, especially like very technocratic regulatory areas like healthcare,
hmm
where we just go and we look and say, what makes sense here? What doesn't? What needs to be clarified, et cetera, et cetera. In the long term, if we're talking about very high stakes decisions, I think we do need technical standards for reliability, explainability, things like that in the models. We're not
Yeah.
there yet. I'm pretty optimistic that we're going to get there. And I think we're going to get there a
Yeah.
lot faster than people think. And I also think that regulation actually hinders our ability to get there. So my general view when it comes to these sorts of things, like high stakes applications of AI, where they're already highly regulated industries, they're highly regulated for a good reason. What I think we need is really good technical standards that allow us to determine, okay, like we need to be able to adjudicate the difference between a person behaving irresponsibly with AI and an AI model going wrong, right? That's the fundamental
hmm
question in liability. Did I drive into the pedestrian or did my car's brakes fail? Two very different
Yep.
questions with very different responsibility. The
Sure.
reason that we can make those questions tangible is that we have a really good concrete understanding of what it is for a car's brakes to fail because we have standards for
Yeah.
brakes and standards for steering wheels and all that kind of stuff. We
Right.
have no such standards for AI. I think we can do it. I think we can
Mm.
build them. But I think that requires a period of open scientific inquiry. And I think a lot of AI regulation makes, especially at the model level, makes that scientific inquiry harder to achieve.
Okay. So one thing that I like that you're saying is this point that others have made, which is something like we don't need a sweeping regulatory regime. We need industry specific regulations.
Yeah.
Potentially. So there's a very complex regulatory scheme for financial services. There's a very complex regulatory scheme for healthcare. And the thing to do is like a gap analysis of okay, what do we make sure that people don't do with AI in healthcare or financial services? What is the regulations in those respective industries right now, and what needs to fill the gap? And is it more regulations that need to fill the gap, or is it just a sort of further extension of existing standards, et cetera, et cetera? I think I heard that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's right.
The other thing that you said about we need more technical specifications, I guess I don't know what that looks like in a way. What I think, for instance, about the sort of one of my go-to examples of something I find at once extremely promising and extremely dangerous is using large language models in diagnostic settings. So doctors need to figure out what's wrong with this person. They need to diagnose the illness, given all these variables, and then, of course, make recommendations for treatment plans as a result. And it looks like LLMs can do really well. There's lots of examples where large language models, AI, does really well at this because, in some sense, and this is not quite right because they're not knowledge machines, but they've ingested all the medical data, right? All the medical journals and all that. And so what you have, at least in principle, is not just someone who is an oncologist, but you have something that is, if you like, an oncologist and an endocrinologist and a geneticist and a pediatrician and just all the things. And so when you want to test this thing, it's very hard to test because you need when it gives an output, it has to get vetted by all these different kinds of specialized doctors. And so, for one thing, when we're talking about when is it safe to deploy an AI in, say, diagnostic settings, that's going to be phenomenally hard to test. One, because you've got to get all these different doctors to vet this thing. And secondly, because the use cases, the context of deployment can be quite fine grained. So maybe it's good at cancer diagnosis for white males aged 18 to 35, and that's the use case, but 36 to 50, it's really bad, or it's bad for black women, but it's great for black men, or it depends on how you dice up the context of deployment. And so what counts as safe is going to be very context sensitive, not to mention very hard to vet because of all the doctors that would need to be involved. I don't see why, to your point, maybe I'm misinterpreting the word technical, but technical standards for safety would apply here or would help us solve the problem. So tell me more, try to convince me more about or persuade me why something like technical specifications for safety are the thing that's needed.
Yeah, so I think it depends on the specific application. Let's take the diagnostic example because I think that's a good one. What I think you'd probably want there is just like a pretty basic reliability standard. One of the things we're investing in right now, I think the AI industry in general, for a lot of different reasons, is automated evaluation of models. And so I think that we will need to design, I think this could be a whole industry, right? I think this AI
Hmm.
model evaluation could be, I'm not going to predict that, but I think it could be like
Yeah, sure.
a pretty rich industry full of
Yeah.
people. Because the problem with model evaluation is that you have to keep it super secret. Because if the evaluation gets out, then the model can train. If it's on the internet, then the model can train on it, and then you don't have a
Yeah.
useful evaluation anymore. So
Right.
I think like developing really good evaluations is something that, again, I see a lot of progress being made on that on a month to month basis. And I think we'll get better at that. But I worry about it in both directions, right? I think we do need to do that work. I think there's a ton of economic incentive to do that work if you're in the AI industry. I also think if you're a doctor, if you're helping to design or advise on what those rules should be, you have a ton of incentive to make those rules impossibly stringent and better than any doctor that's currently alive, right? It's the same thing we've seen with the self-driving car problem, where it seems like the self-driving cars that exist are better than human drivers, safer than human drivers. But whenever they mess up, it's a much bigger deal, which is perfectly reasonable because we're automating a dangerous thing. So we should have higher standards, right? And just as a general rule, we should want our standards for medical diagnosis or vehicle safety to go up significantly over time. Add more
Yeah.
nines.
Well, I mean, this is another issue where I'm just going to repeat what I said earlier, which is that people are remarkably shitty at things. They're really bad at things. And so
Yeah, right.
one thing that has to be kept in mind in these safety discussions is what's the appropriate threshold for sufficiently safe to deploy? And if the standard is usually humans, even in the criminal justice system, we're really bad at making judgments. We're really bad at making predictions, which is what AI largely does. I actually think that it might be the case that people hold an unreasonably high, I don't know, watermark for AI to meet, almost near perfection. Sometimes it's unreasonably high because they seem to be assuming that people do this stuff amazingly well. But if you reset your assumption and recognize, actually, people, the average person they're not that great. They're not that great at
Including
their job.
doctors, including lawyers, right?
Yes,
Including
exactly.
advanced degree
Yeah,
holding professionals. They get tired, they get
right.
hungry, they get bored.
Exactly right.
Yeah,
You're right. Aside from just having a certain limited mental capacities, but they shrugged through and they were lashed in their med school class.
right.
Aside from those things, there's all those other things you articulated. They're tired, they're stressed out, they're anxious, they're distracted, they're hungover, they're whatever. One thing that we have to get really clear on, and I don't think we are, is how good are humans at task X?
Yeah,
And I think we probably don't have. I haven't heard anyone talk about this in any detail, or I haven't seen anything where there's good measurement around here's how good people are at tasks X, Y, and Z, and then using that as the relevant threshold for is the AI sufficiently safe to deploy?
yeah,
The car example is an exception where I think it's been shown that self driving cars are actually better than the average human driver because the average human driver is terrible because they're distracted and tired and et cetera, et cetera. But it's not as good as the best human drivers yet. That is to say, it's not as good as the non
yeah.
distracted, non tired, non anxious, et cetera
I think that's
driver.
right. Yeah.
It feels like we need more data about humans in order to make these safety judgment calls.
Actually, the more data point is one I want to jump on because I think that this kind of my primary concern really as a policy person is the diffusion of AI because my general view is that technology innovation is not like particularly important or meaningful if people don't use it. Like the fact that the
Yeah.
iPhone exists inside of Cupertino, California labs does not matter to me if it's not in billions of people's hands. That's what
Yeah.
changes the world. That's what leads to the transformative power of technology. So diffusion of AI really matters to me. There were studies. I was just a study. I don't know how reliable it was. I haven't vetted this study, but I just saw it briefly across my inbox that the US is actually one of the lowest countries population-wise in terms of penetration of ChatGPT. How many people have used ChatGPT? More
Interesting.
people in Kenya and Pakistan have used ChatGPT, at least for on a survey, than in the US by like a significant
Hmm.
amount. And that worries me. That's also the general sense I have just being in the world, living in America. My general sense is not sure how many people are using this. I'm not sure how enthusiastic they are about this. So I want adoption, right? And so I think that what we will realize as AI does move into these kind of higher regulated, higher stakes industries, I suspect that what we will realize is that in some ways we have overregulated those industries. I don't think anybody would
Mm.
dispute the notion that hospitals are in some sense overregulated. People might want other regulations, we disagree on that, blah, 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 blah. Single payer healthcare,
Sure.
whatever. Go look at a state regulatory code for hospitals. Like you'll be shocked and sad. So I think we'll figure that out over time. And what I think would be wonderful is, especially in a period, these questions you're raising, it's like there's a lot of uncertainty. We don't fully understand how the model works. There'll probably be always some degree of illegibility that always remains with these very large neural networks. And also, we don't understand biology, fuck.
Yeah.
It's not like we have a perfect understanding of either side of this equation. So I think in the face of that uncertainty, experimentation is essential. So things like regulatory sandboxes, where we say we don't know how it works. We don't know if AI is going to lead to better health outcomes or not. So let's try. Let's see. Let's give some people a license to evade some not all of the regulations, but the very specific regulations that make it hard to adopt generalist AI in hospital settings. And let's put them in. Let's not fire everyone. We're going to have human employees at these places. Let's put them in. Let's let them have a lower cost structure. And let's see. Let's empirically assess this. I think that's ultimately, I'm an empiricist. I think that's the only question. That's the only solution to problems like this in the long term.
So I guess that all sounds reasonable. Let me just ask you this. I can hear some people saying, yeah, look, what you're really talking about is a wait and see approach. Let's see if things go sideways. And if they do, then we can come up with new regulations. But if we know or if we strongly suspect the shit's going to hit the fan, shouldn't we be proactive about that?
Yes, if we strongly suspect that the shit is going to hit the fan, but I don't think we know that. There's some people who strongly suspect that, but I haven't seen a lot of compelling evidence that's the case. There's also the big question of what do you actually do to mitigate against those harms? I'll just make this concrete for you. We're not at war with China, but we anticipate that war with China is possible. And so we are taking actions to be prepared for that eventuality. Good, fine,
Hmm.
maybe not, maybe bad, right? But I think good. But you can debate that.
Hmm.
But it seems to me like, okay, that's reasonable. If we're talking about problems that come from the diffusion of the general purpose technology, that is so hard to forecast. And I think
Yeah.
it's ultimately based on such complex, nonlinear dynamic systems that of society and the economy and all these things. Like,
Yeah.
how can you possibly know? And so I think you do just have to take a wait and I'm an empiricist, so I love waiting and seeing. But also, I think more importantly, there is a Shakespearean relationship that exists and has existed for a long time between the things people are worried about and the things that people do to reduce those worries, to mitigate against the risks that they perceive, especially in policy. Shakespeare is all about people being worried about things and causing the thing they were worried about to happen. I think the same thing is quite likely with AI. The same thing happens in policy, right? Look at the war on poverty, right? Look at the Great Society. Look at what happened as a
Hmm.
result of that. And the things that we now say are like, oh, those were like unambiguously white supremacist policies. And it's not at the time. Or war on crime in the 90s, right? Jesse Jackson loved that stuff. He loved higher
Hmm.
mandatory minimums on crack cocaine because crack cocaine was ravaging the black community. And now everybody says, but that ended up being so bad for the black community. And that's my point. That's my point, is that policy intervention oftentimes can accelerate problems. And I think that's
Mm.
super possible in a lot of ways with AI. I think the most concrete way to imagine that is if we step back from the specific use cases and we talk about the sort of AI safety community and this idea that we need to create regulations on the frontier models that would have the effect of centralizing AI development in a few companies. Or in the extreme, I think if you talk to a lot of the AI, especially if you give them a beer or two, the AI safety people, what they'll really say is, we think the Pentagon should be doing this. This should be in a bunker
Hmm.
controlled by the US Army. A lot of people think that. I think that to the extent you insulate the development, especially of something like AGI, from market processes, social processes, public input, I think you run the risk of weird, dangerous outcomes happening. And weird,
Hmm.
dangerous outcomes are possible here. But my attitude is not, oh, this is going to go great by default and we have no work to do. Don't worry about it. No,
Sure, sure.
there's a lot of ways this could go wrong. And I think about them all the time. It's just that my general perception of history and like my theoretical understanding of public choice economics and political theory and things like that all leads me to the conclusion that most policy interventions would make that worse.
So all that's super helpful, and interesting. And I take it, and you said this earlier, that a lot of your approach is driven by a kind of epistemic humility, just a kind of humility about how well we know how things are going to get used, how things are going to unfold. There's a ton of variables at play. And to assume or presume that you know how things are going to unfold or how they're probably going to unfold, and to presume to know what kinds of interventions are going to stave off those kinds of things that we want to avoid, it's an act of hubris to think that you know all those things sufficiently well. And I take it that, and this is really one of the big takeaways, I think, from our discussion, there's loads of ways that government can act in ways to safeguard people that don't involve regulations or don't involve new regulations. Number one, there's enforcing existing regulations. And number two, there's just all sorts of non-regulatory ways that government can play a role, like the entire judicial system, as you mentioned. One thing that you're not saying, I take it, is it's the Wild West, let the Wild West, and then we'll regulate later if
Yeah.
things go sideways. It's not the Wild West. We've got lots of stuff. We've got lots of mechanisms by which we can prosecute, we can jail, we can make certain things illegal or recognize that certain uses of AI are already or would be illegal. And there's all kinds of mechanisms to monitor these kinds of things. And because they can monitor them, then they can also step in, hopefully at the appropriate time. And so I take your point that the wait and see approach isn't a cavalier approach. It's epistemic humility. We don't know what we don't know. We don't know how best to intervene. We don't know all the variables and how they interact with each other, combined with a kind of confidence in the mechanisms that we already have in place.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're a pretty sophisticated and advanced society. A lot of Americans don't think that today. They self-impose this sort of Neanderthal image on our country. And my perception is, I don't know, we just taught sand how to think. Feel pretty good about the state of our civilization in a lot of different ways. But more to the point, there is significant uncertainty here. Nobody would disagree about that. And the ultimate question is, if you're trying to navigate uncertainty as doing statecraft under uncertainty, I think the ideal approach is to think about what the major questions are and come up with plans to make them less uncertain, right? Advance the epistemic ball is the way I often put it. I think that's
like
not
that.
always what government needs to do, right? But I think that in this particular situation, that's what we need. And that doesn't, to me, look a lot like regulation. In fact, I think that what regulation does in this case, like safety regulation, is it creates the illusion of certainty where there is still uncertainty. And if you create that illusion, what you're actually ultimately doing is creating more chaos. We're seeing this, like this bill, I won't go too much into it, but this bill in California, SB 1047, which is like the most advanced AI safety legislation in the country. And by advanced, I just mean like likely to pass. This bill has so many questions with it that now that it's public, the AI community is asking, and it's, oh man, we're going to have to litigate so much of this. There's so much inherent ambiguity in this stuff. And to me, it's, okay, you haven't done anything then. You've actually moved us back because you've just created a bunch of new questions that now have legal stakes, potentially criminal stakes attached to them.
Yeah.
And I just think we shouldn't do that unless it's absolutely necessary.
All right, Dean, thank you so much. This has been super fascinating. Yeah, lots to think about. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks so much, everyone, for listening. And now let me thank the people who have made this podcast possible. So, first of all, we have Delano Alexander. He's been with me since day one. He showed me even how to start recording a podcast in the first place. He does editing stuff. He's been fantastic, and he does really everything I ask him to and more. I've never met anyone else who just says so much. Yeah, I don't know how to do that, but I'll figure it out. What more could you ask for in a producer? Next up, Jennifer Strong, my podcast guru. I don't know what else to call her. She just has advised me on how to design the podcast, how to grow it, and she's responsible for, if you like, this kind of season 2 relaunch and everything around it. So thank you to you, Jennifer. Next up, Meg Marco, responsible for all the excellent artwork. Before I did the artwork, I didn't really know what I was doing. We put it together. It worked well enough. but I think Meg really did a phenomenal job bringing everything together. Garrett Lang, sound engineer that I frankly don't deserve. He's just too good for this podcast. Don't tell him I said that, though. Next up, Benjamin Koltgen. He is a professor of philosophy who has helped me source guests, identify who's interesting, who has things to say, etc., etc. So without him, I wouldn't have anyone to talk to. And then finally, Ashley Wasylenko, who helps with all manner of administrative things, making sure that the podcast guests find their way to the podcast, can schedule the recording, get their bios and headshots, and really just keeping the show on the rails and me organized. Thanks to all of you. Really appreciate all your hard work.